Hi there, it's Marcus here. Week 3, thinking about human webs, particularly the wonderful work of the father and son team, William and John McNeill. That's the reading for week 3. And I've also been thinking about, I guess, the role that a scholar or historian plays in sifting through the various forms of approaching complexity, the human web, particularly in relating to this week, but also how historians often skew their own inquiries, their own biases come out, with definitely bias towards textuality, with bias towards urbanization and so on. Some of that I want to point out in this particular recording. So let's move on. I'm going to share screen, jump across to here. Donna, I like the magic of PowerPoint. So here we are, snapshot number 2. And we're looking at the human webs, of course. So I hope you're all traveling well, by the way. I should remember my manners, shouldn't I? I think I'm getting a little bit better. Certainly, I'm not as likely to have my sort of attacks as I was. So things are looking up, at least in the short term. Let's keep moving. So what have we got first of all? Okay, yeah, I wanted to focus on this point, first of all, and to illustrate it. So there's tension between historians and scholars, or around that. The work of historian scholars involves looking for patterns. That's one of the reasons why we use the metaphor of the map, because a map is a patterned way of interpreting geophysical information, but also conceptual information like a concept map, all right, which is assessment number 1. So we're looking for differences and similarities, or as I say here, the other way around, similarities and differences, often in experiences as some kind of tension, all right? They don't necessarily sit well together, but historians and scholars, well, we'd have nothing to do if there wasn't tension and paradox and sort of the interpretive stuff that goes along with that. So this is where I want to start today's reflection. Okay, so what can we say about a map? So this is me just thinking straight off the top of my head, probably less than an hour ago. So a map orients us to the world or mindscape, landscape that we're in, because it can be a conceptual map or it can be a geophysical map. Such maps reveal the elements of the topography. I hope you're familiar with that word. It means, the mountains, the hills, the rivers, the valleys, and so on. But it also means the major ideas, the key assumptions, the values of a place or a people, and so on. Some maps, as I point out here, are geophysical, but others there are deeper maps as well. Okay, such as David Christian's map of complexity that he's pointing to. A map of complexity, for instance, helps us understand the world as layered and open-ended. It's always moving. This is important to understand as a geophysical map, something like Google Maps, is both descriptive and directional. It gives us a sense of direction. It gives us some choices maybe in making a certain attempt to get from A to B, but those choices are always limited because the kind of geophysical map that a Google map is going to follow the rules of roads are here and so on. You can put down, I want to walk, I want to ride a bike, I want to drive a car, I want to catch a taxi, I want to catch a train. So there are certain parameters that you might feed into your map as filters, you could say. But beyond that, you go with that kind of map. So these are what I think of as singular maps. So the time map and the space map that are described by David Christian in the week 1 reading are reasonably limited. That from the map of complexity's perspective, they are dead ends. They don't really help us. That, to understand that, our planet, this beautiful planet Earth, is part of a solar system, which is part of a galaxy, which is part of, the universe, doesn't really help us very much. It was 500 years ago or so, it was an astonishing idea. But today, it is so much part of our worldview, you could say, our broader maps of being, that we take it for granted. It doesn't really change the way we behave. That means, and that's also true for maps of time, to understand, oh God, it's going to take us, 5 million years to reach that star, 1 billion years to reach that star, and so on. Doesn't really help us very much. But a map of complexity helps us understand process. So my point here is that Christian is trying to escape the power of a singular map by suggesting that complexity, with its thresholds and fluidity, is much more like the way that the cosmos and then life, therefore life, functions. Okay? For David Christian, a map is a worldview or a paradigm. If you read, as I think I've said before, the introduction to his big fat book, Maps of Time, he will talk about these maps as basically mythic narratives. And he states quite clearly that the map of complexity, the maps that he's offering us in big history, are simply the best maps that he can find at the moment to explain the reality that we're in. So in looking at a map of complexity, we need to look for patterns, asking how does the work of these authors link up? What are the similarities? Are there differences and tensions? So I'm going to compare the work of McNeill and McNeill with Indigenous ways of knowing. That's the Neil and Kelly book that I got my hands on, thoroughly enjoying, jumping my way through it. So this is a very interesting one because one takes, the given historical kind of map that McNeill and McNeill are following in their lovely, rich description of old world maps, they call them, particularly, the Silk Road and those sorts of places, the way that hubs and so on generate greater forms of energy coherence. They generate, more accelerated forms of collective learning and so on. But what are they missing out? Well, I want to bring some of this out. I want to talk about the differences and tensions as much as anything else. Two great quotes from the first few pages of week 3 reading about webs and complexity. So the first thing that McNeill and McNeill note, is that until cities arose, face-to-face communication with small communities carried almost all the important messages governing human behaviour. Encounters with strangers and neighbours were only occasional and seldom brought anything new to local attention that required or invited changes in existing habits. Okay, so that's their view of the way that webs have thickened up the human relational capacity, the way that it's sped up the movement of knowledge, of and ideas and so on, innovations, but also just energy, in terms of resourcing communities and so on. Just before that, they say civilized forms of human society would wring more food and energy from the environment than before, thereby generating superior, and that's a very strong value judgment, a superior wealth and power. Now, I'm thinking here about books like, about the, what was it called? The affluent foragers and so on. That, there was that we've got to look at the way we measure affluence, wealth, richness, and so on. We've got to be careful about the kind of judgments that we, I guess, are projecting onto the kind of information and narrative that we have. Now, these guys, in their book, Songline, the book's called, by the way, First Knowledges. It's on order at the library because it's a very new book. They point out that Indigenous history is written in the land. It's not a map that we, going back one now, impose on the land. This one is written in the land. It's a different kind of history, deep in the land and transmitted via the songlines. Now, the songlines, the way these authors describe it, are mnemonic, embodied forms of knowing the land that grow out of a deep cultural association with the land. Now, I'm going to come back to that in a moment. So they go on to say the deep history of this continent, Australia, is in the black soil, black being Indigenous soil, beneath the white or colonizer soil. It lies in the millennia before white settlers started laying down their stories a couple of 100 years ago. Now, the interesting thing for me in relation to this course at this moment, week 3, is that what we can see here is that there is a divide between the urban and the non-urban, and that divide really does influence the way historians tell the story. Historians are interested in the dramatic, they're interested in the powerful visual elements of, let's say, of archaeology, of ancient texts, of sculptures, of things like the pyramids, the step pyramids across the Afro-Eurasian continent, the step pyramids of the Inca and the Maya and the Olmec and so on. They're interested in this sort of stuff. Why? Because it's visual, it invites narrative, and we've been encultured into thinking about that sort of stuff. What these people are saying in the Songlines book is that there is a different kind of story being told, a different kind of knowing, a different kind of being, a different kind of presencing that is not, as the Westerners would have said, non-historical or ahistorical. It is a different form of narrative. It's a different form of meaning making or map making, and that this map making is culturally cohesive for Indigenous peoples. There's a tension there. How do we handle that tension? Well, I'm not 100% sure. I'm still thinking about it. I've just been reading that book. I'm going, oh, that's so interesting. Go, oh, and compare that to McNeill and McNeill. I'm doing what an academic would do, and I'm inviting you to do the same. All right, so let's look at, well, what does it mean to be civilized? Well, first of all, the word civilized comes from the Latin word civitas or civitas, which it relates or pertains to a city, life in a city. The concept civilization, as we have it, privileges a certain kind of text over the oral. It privileges specialization. You're a bread baker, you're a potter, you're a soldier, you're a scribe, you're a king, and so on. It is deeply hierarchical in order, so you've got priests and kings, and we're going to come to that towards the end of this thought bubble. It privileges the center, let's say Babylon or Ur, or some ancient city in the Indus Valley, like, well, we give them the names like Mohenjo-daro, but that wasn't the names of that the inhabitants gave those places. We just don't know what they were called. Okay, so it privileges the city over the agricultural periphery and so on. It privileges religion, a certain form of ordered relationship and philosophy and worldview, over the more broadly speaking spirituality, particularly the kind of spirituality presented in a book like Songlines. It privileges law, as in legal systems, over law, as in cultural ways of appropriate behavior. Probably, oh, I know why I put that there. As I've already said, it really privileges the urban over the country. And then I put in two Greek terms, nomos and physis. Nomos is culture, law, ways of human ways of being. Physis is generally taken in the Greek sense as in the natural. It's a live link, so you can click on that link later and you can go, if you're curious, go and have a look at some of the early forms of debate around nomos and physis. They date back to roughly the 5th century BCE in Greece, particularly associated with the sophists, who were a, what do we call them? They were a pedagogic movement that sort of laid the foundations for the Socratic approach and the Platonic approach, but they were also deeply averse to some of what Socrates and Plato were saying. A very interesting period of to go and look at. But nomos and physos, nature versus nurture, we might say, except I should say nurture, because nurture is nomos and nature is physos. Have a look at that. So these are some of the elements that you would have to say, in the Western way of looking at things, the traditional historical way of looking at things, mark the civilized. So McNeill are thinking, webs and so on, the human web. And that, their greatest, exemplary web would be the Silk Road. This is a link. You can see that it's got a little, it goes to the New York Times. It's a lovely little article. Okay, and just so that you know, I've set aside a really great reading from the National Geographics. We should have them by then. I mean, I've sent them off to the library, but they're going through, oh, can we use these articles because of copyright? So I'm still waiting to hear some of that, I'm afraid. But, you know, you should have the week 7 reading available. There is a link to another, which is why you can see the reading standing out there. There is a link to another great National Geographic article on the Silk Road. It's one of those themes or topics that gets written about constantly. So it's not that there's any want of information on it. You know, and all these fantastic cities in Central Asia, Tashkent and Samarkand and places like that, have been so important in the history of human philosophy, abstraction, and so on as well. Yes, with some incredibly significant names associated with those particular cities as well. Marco Polo went waltzing along them. So did Ibn Khaldun. No, not Khaldun. He's the historian. I can't think of his name, Ibn something or other. It'll come to me, no doubt, as soon as I finish recording. And Gil and Rosie might be, oh, yes, it's that guy. He actually travelled, he was an Arab traveller who travelled much further than Marco Polo ever did. Okay, of course, we privilege, you know, the Western person over the non-Western person, or the Christian person over the non-Christian person, however you want to frame that. But let's keep moving. So, I just want to talk about one significant figure from the past, Ashurbanipal. Okay, he lived in the city of Nineveh, which is known from the Bible. He was what we call a new Assyrian king. The Assyrians were a powerful ethnic and cultural group in Mesopotamia that it really held political power for close on to 1500 years. One of the things that I think is most interesting about this particular king is that he was literate. He could read that cuneiform that you can see around him in the image there. But he wasn't just literate. He actually was he was a geek. He was obsessed with literature. And he was the person that, as far as we know, that created the first systematic library. And it is from that library that the initial texts for the Gilgamesh epic were found. Now, if you're wondering whom I'm talking about, I would go and have a look at at Canvas and at the modules, because in week 3, or for week 3, the little reading from the National Geographic is on the discovery and translation of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, Gilgamesh epic is really important because it predates biblical records, and it has a Noah figure and a great flood and all those sorts of things, but of course not called Noah, because of course the Israelites took that tradition and brought it into their own religious mythology or legend. I mean, everybody doubt, historians doubt that there was a single great flood, but they're aware that there were major floods, cataclysms, and so on, involving water that presumably laid the foundation in some way for the epic roles that Noah and others played in flood aversion, you might say. But I wanted to point out this guy because he represents a certain kind of civilized king. But, you know, if you go and look him up, he writes these great poems, and they're often about cutting people's hands and feet off and cutting their noses and ears off, gouging out their eyes and so on, making mountains of, you know, out of heads and so on. So, you know, he was literate and so on, but, you know, he was also an imperialist. And just like all imperialists, he didn't shy away from using violence to enforce his hold on power and so on. All right. So there's that one. And then, of course, let's return for a moment to McNeill and McNeill. So I want to reflect here on the success of the urban in capturing the way we see the world. McNeil have this to say: the differentiation of skills, which we talked about already, that's called specialization, between cities and surrounding populations established webs of exchange and communication. Exchange is code for energy and communication is code for collective learning, David Christian's language, okay, across hundreds and eventually thousands of miles. Each civilization acquired hinterlands. In other words, there was a center and a periphery where landowners and other privileged persons did what they could to mimic chosen aspects of the urban life. Yuval Harari talks about this in terms of the pyramid builders, for instance. This elite ruling class, you could call them, formed its own regional webs, resting in turn on top of older local village webs. So webs led to webs. Now we're getting complexity, aren't we, building up here? And had the effect of molting. It shouldn't be molting. Had the effect of making ordinary village people we can now all call peasants serve the social superiors in many different ways. That's what happens when you cut and paste from PDFs that are a bit rough. Apologies for that. Cities thus became able to tap resources far and near. So that, I think, is a central idea in McNeil's work, that cities somehow drew together, synthesized, and came up with innovative solutions to a wide range of problems that weren't encountered by less intensely living human beings. Okay, that's really important. You can see cities as the kind of pressure cooker in which human culture, human sociality was honed over hundreds and thousands of years. So two final images I have here. One is I've been thinking, and Gil, Rosie, and I have been talking a lot about the concept map for assessment 1 and for the 300 words that you need to write about the maps of complexity. One of the things I want to say is one way to look at the concept map is think of it as an infographic. You're probably all familiar with infographics. This one is alive. Yeah, I thought it was. And I just took this as a snip out of a much larger infographic talking about the history of infographics. But, the thing about an infographic is that it is graphic. It's not necessarily heavily textual. So the people who pulled this infographic together are saying, well, look, their infographic going right back to, Indigenous Australian and the artworks on the cave walls in north of Spain and the south of France and so on. And they give us little bits of information along the way. One of the things that this particular infographic doesn't do is demonstrate the interconnectivity between the various sites. But even so, it's one way to think about this concept map. And I want to keep reiterating, the concept map is worth only 8 marks out of the 25 for that first assessment piece. It is more a way of getting us to think, and I say us because Gil and Rosie and I are all having to sort of get our heads around it as well, getting us all to think outside of I'm an academic just going to write, the 300 words. We need to stretch, and I guess that's the song lines again, stretch our maps of thinking and our ways of thinking. It's too easy just to sit around and come up with an essay. You've been writing essays since, you were year 10 or something in high school, or maybe even earlier. If you're an adult, you've been reading and writing essays, or, just writing letters or emails or whatever it is for a long time. Text is very important. Historians will be lost without it, but I want to bring in another dimension to our thinking and to reaffirm the fact that, we think not just with words, but we think with images and the visual. And, if we take songlines seriously, we actually embody that thinking as well. So this is the second last slide. I'm just throwing it out there. If you go, what the hell is he talking about? Just keep on moving for the time being, and come back to it sometime when you're starting to think again about infographics and concept maps, maybe in your second or third year of your academic work. This is the last slide. There's an Ashurbanipal type guy sitting there in his kingly chair, the throne, and there are clearly things going on. Not only is the size of the individuals indicative of their relationship, the king is bigger than the vassals or the whoever it is that are coming to see him, but the whole process is ritualized, and I want to talk about that. Because one of the things that comes again, I'll wave this book songlines at you, it was coming to me from that book, is the fact that, songlines were sung, they were enacted, they were danced, and in these ways, they were embodied. So what does ritual do? So ritual itself brings form and order to the world. It also points to abstract beliefs and maintains power relationships. So it does things. It brings some level of order to the world. It points to abstract beliefs. I'm going to talk about that a bit more. But abstract beliefs are assumptions that the world is like it is because, let's say, gods or supernatural beings or whatever it was did certain things in the world that we've inherited, and we understand that their doing happened before our own time. And it also maintains power relationships, like the power relationship between this king and those vassals there. Two examples. There's a great little reading that I came across some time ago, in which a child, a 3-year-old boy, was found in the back of a cave in Kenya. Carbon dating showed that this child died about 78,000 years ago and was actually buried with care, with tenderness, in the living area of these people. Now, we know that 15 to 12,000 years ago, there was a little town called Chadalhuyuk, and they used to bury their people, their relatives and close family people of all kinds, in their own kitchens and dining rooms and living rooms and so on as well. So this is a long-term continuity, even though Chadalhuyuk is at least 2,000 kilometers further north from this. But this child is the oldest burial that we know of in the main continent of Africa. And the way the child was buried, wrapped up and so on, indicates the presence of culture and a set of rituals and beliefs about the dead. Okay, so that's really important. And there's a link there to a little YouTube clip, 2 minutes long or something like that, that you might want to go and have a look at. But also, as I've been saying, rituals maintain hierarchy, as in the Mesopotamian kingship hierarchy that we're looking at here. And I want to end with that. I want to go back to this idea of the map. Rituals are part of map making. We go through all sorts of rituals. The ritual, and I want you to stop thinking of ritual as in religious or something like that. Rituals are just the way we do things. If you brushed your teeth this morning or last night, and you've probably done that for the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years, however old you are, that's a ritual. It's a ritual that sort of points towards hygiene, oral hygiene. But let's think about other forms of rituals. The learning processes that we have in kindergarten or preschool, primary school, secondary school, and universities, they're all highly ritualized. They not necessarily, and rituals change all the time. We now, I'm not allowed to meet with you in a lecture theatre and give you a long talk any longer. The ritual of the lecture currently is out of favour with educational power blocks. Yeah, definitely. I'm not saying that it was worse or better. It probably suits some students over others and so on. But of course, they're looking for empirical evidence, so they come up with a whole bunch of data about how you guys hate lectures and love this current mode of interaction. If you disagree with that, tell Gil and Rosie. I'll be happy to hear it, because I think it's a load of bull, personally. But nonetheless, there are rituals there. So there's the ritual of the lecture, there's a ritual of the classroom in which you have the high priest, that's called the teacher up the front, and there are you little guys like this image here down there. You know your place. The teacher is the giver of all knowledge and dispenser of, the blessings, you could say. Now I better stop there because I can tell that I'm going to start ranting soon because I feel quite strongly about the way we educate and miseducate and send the wrong messages in multiple ways. Click, stop the share. All right, so that's it. That's the week 3 snapshot 2 thought bubble for me. Hope it was useful. Thank you very much, and I'll talk to you again next week.